Imagine this, it's a quiet afternoon on a suburban street, the kind of day where nothing much seems to happen. The sun is out, kids are playing a block away, and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze gives the whole neighborhood a peaceful vibe. But all of that is about to change. A sleek black car pulls up to the curb. It's a luxury model, the kind that turns heads without trying too hard. The driver, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, steps out. His suit is sharp, his shoes polished, and he carries himself with a quiet confidence. He's here for a quick meeting, maybe to check on a property or finalize a business deal. To the outside world, he's just another man going about his day. But within moments, this ordinary scene will spiral into something extraordinary. Down the street, a police cruiser sits parked at an angle, 2 officers inside. They've been there for a while, idling, scanning the neighborhood. The driver, a stocky officer with mirrored sunglasses, nudges his partner. "Hey," he says, nodding toward the man in the suit. "What's he doing around here?" The partner, younger and eager to prove himself, frowns. "Looks out of place," he mutters. "Let's check it out," the driver decides, flipping on the cruiser's lights. The peaceful street is suddenly awash in red and blue, and the wail of the siren breaks the calm. The man in the suit looks up, momentarily surprised but not rattled. He stands by his car, waiting as the police approach. He's done nothing wrong, and he knows it. But there's a familiar tension in his stance, the kind that comes from too many encounters like this. The officers step out, hands resting on their belts. Their faces are a mix of suspicion and authority. "Afternoon," the older cop says, his tone more commanding than friendly. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" The man in the suit keeps his voice calm and measured. "Just taking care of some business," he replies, his words steady and clear. "Is there a problem?" The younger cop steps forward, eyes narrowing. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle," he lies, his tone heavy with accusation. "Do you have ID?" The man doesn't flinch. Slowly, he reaches for his wallet, his every move deliberate and non-threatening. "Of course," he says, handing over his driver's license. He knows the drill. The older officer takes the ID and glances at it. His expression doesn't change, but there's a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or confusion. He looks at his partner, then back at the man. "This your car?" he asks, his tone still sharp. "Yes," the man replies evenly. "Is there a reason you're asking?" The younger cop circles the car, peering through the windows. "Nice ride," he mutters, almost to himself. Then, louder, "How do you afford something like this?" The question hangs in the air, loaded with implication. The man's gaze doesn't waver. "Hard work," he says simply. The older officer shifts his weight, glancing again at the ID in his hand. "What kind of work do you do?" he asks, a hint of challenge in his voice. The man takes a breath, his calm exterior never cracking. "I'm a CO," he says, his voice steady and unassuming. "I run my own company." For a moment, there's silence. The officers exchange a look, their expressions a mix of disbelief and something else, maybe embarrassment, maybe realization. They weren't expecting this. Their assumptions, their entire approach, have been built on a narrative that's now crumbling in real time. The older cop clears his throat, suddenly less sure of himself. "CO, huh?" he says, trying to mask his surprise. "What kind of company?" The man smiles, just a little, but there's no malice in it. "A pretty successful one," he says, his tone still calm but with a quiet strength that's impossible to miss. Before the officers can respond, the radio in their cruiser crackles to life. There's a call coming in, something urgent. They exchange another quick look, and the older cop hands back the ID. "Well," he says, his voice more subdued now, "just doing our job. Have a nice day." With that, they retreat to their car, the tension hanging heavy in the air. The man watches as they drive off, the flashing lights fading into the distance. He stands there for a moment, processing what just happened, before calmly getting back into his car. But here's the thing, the story doesn't end here. Because what those officers didn't realize is that this man's job isn't just any CEO role. It's something much bigger, much more impactful, and when they find out the truth, their reaction will be unforgettable. As the patrol car disappeared around the corner, the man sat in his car for a moment, staring at the dashboard, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Outside, the neighborhood had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but inside his mind, things were far from calm. Encounters like this weren't new, but they were never easy to shake off. He had worked his entire life to reach the position he was in, and yet moments like these were a reminder that, in some eyes, his success didn't shield him from suspicion. He glanced at his watch. The meeting he had scheduled was still a few minutes away, but he wasn't going to let the earlier encounter throw him off. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car again, smoothing his jacket as he walked toward the building ahead. It was a modest structure, an old community center that had seen better days. But to him, it was more than just a meeting spot, it was a symbol of what he was trying to accomplish. Inside, a small group of people was already waiting. They were gathered in a circle, their voices low but animated, a mix of community leaders, local business owners, and a few residents. They turned as he entered, their faces lighting up in recognition and relief. "Glad you made it," said one of the men, a tall figure with a warm smile and a firm handshake. He was the kind of person who commanded attention without trying, a natural leader in his own right. "Wouldn't miss it," the man in the suit replied, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone used to making decisions that mattered. He took a seat, and the conversation quickly picked up where it left off. The meeting wasn't just about business. It was about change, real, lasting change. The man in the suit wasn't just any CEO. He was the founder of an organization dedicated to revitalizing underserved communities, creating opportunities where there had been none. He wasn't just building wealth for himself, he was laying the groundwork for others to rise alongside him. As the discussion unfolded, he listened more than he spoke, taking in the concerns and ideas of the people around him. They talked about everything from improving local schools to providing affordable housing and supporting small businesses. These weren't abstract concepts to him, they were the core of his mission. But even as he focused on the task at hand, the earlier encounter with the police lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't just about him. It was about the barriers that so many people in communities like this one faced every day, barriers built on assumptions and biases that were hard to break down. One of the women in the group, a teacher at the local high school, spoke up. "It's not just about the resources," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "It's about changing how people see us. How they see themselves. If we can do that, we can change everything." The man nodded. "That's exactly why we're here," he said. "It's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about creating something better." The meeting went on for another hour, filled with ideas and plans, each one more ambitious than the last. By the time they wrapped up, there was a renewed sense of purpose in the room. People left with handshakes and promises to follow up, their steps lighter despite the weight of the challenges ahead. As the man walked back to his car, he noticed a few kids playing basketball on a nearby court. They looked over as he passed, their eyes widening slightly when they saw his car. He gave them a nod and a small smile, and they quickly went back to their game, their laughter echoing in the quiet street. He got into the car and started the engine, but instead of driving off immediately, he sat there for a moment, watching the kids play. They reminded him of himself at that age, back when the world seemed full of possibilities but also obstacles. He had worked hard to overcome those obstacles, but he knew not everyone had the same opportunities he did. That was why he did what he did, so that someday, those kids wouldn't have to fight as hard just to be seen for who they really were. His phone buzzed on the console, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from one of his staff members, a quick update on a new project they were launching in another city. He replied with a few words of encouragement, then set the phone down. There was still so much to do, but he felt a renewed sense of determination. Encounters like the one earlier that day wouldn't define him or derail his mission. If anything, they only made him more resolute. Pulling away from the curb, he drove toward his next appointment. The day was far from over, and there were more people to meet, more plans to put into motion. But even as he moved forward, the weight of what had happened earlier stayed with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of why his work was so important. The officers, meanwhile, had returned to their usual patrol, but their minds were not as clear as they appeared. The older cop couldn't shake the look on the man's face, the calm confidence that had thrown him off balance. He had seen a lot of things in his career, but something about this encounter stuck with him. His partner, on the other hand, was trying to brush it off. "Just another day," he said with a shrug as they cruised through another quiet street. But the older officer wasn't so sure. Something told him they hadn't seen the last of the man in the suit. The older cop drove in silence, his thoughts still tangled around the encounter with the man in the suit. Something about it didn't sit right, not in the usual way where instinct told him someone was hiding something, but in a different way entirely. He couldn't help but feel they had misjudged the situation, and the man. His partner, now scrolling through his phone with one hand on the door, seemed less bothered. For him, it was just another routine stop, one of dozens they made in a week. But the older officer felt a pull, a nagging urge to understand more. Later that night, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, his laptop open in front of him. Out of curiosity, or maybe a sense of guilt, he decided to look up the name on the driver's license. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, maybe a LinkedIn profile or some corporate bio. What he did find, however, made his stomach drop. There it was, in bold letters on the homepage of a high-profile nonprofit, the man's name, listed as the CEO and founder. The organization wasn't just successful, it was groundbreaking, with projects spanning multiple cities and partnerships with major players in government and the private sector. Headlines described him as a visionary and a game-changer, someone who had dedicated his career to addressing systemic inequality and rebuilding communities from the ground up. Scrolling further, the officer saw photos of the man standing beside prominent political figures, shaking hands with mayors, and even giving a speech at a national conference. The irony of their earlier assumptions hit him like a punch to the gut. Here was a man who had likely done more for the community in a year than he had in his entire career as a cop. But that wasn't all. As he dug deeper, he stumbled upon something unexpected, an upcoming initiative that the man's organization was spearheading. It was bold, ambitious, and aimed directly at reforming community policing. The plan included establishing a network of community resource hubs that would serve as alternatives to traditional police interventions. It was the kind of project that could shift the balance of power and trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. And it was set to launch in their city within the next few weeks. The older cop leaned back in his chair, a weight settling on his chest. If this initiative took off, it would mean big changes for how they operated. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. On one hand, he knew the system needed improvement, he'd seen firsthand how things could go wrong. But on the other hand, change was unsettling, especially for someone who had spent decades working within a certain framework. The next morning, he decided not to share what he'd found with his partner just yet. He wanted more time to process it himself. But as the day went on, it became clear that the wheels were already in motion. Rumors started circulating at the precinct about a new program that might shake things up. Some officers were skeptical, others defensive. Change, even when necessary, was rarely met with open arms. Meanwhile, the man in the suit, unaware of the officer's late-night research, was moving forward with his plans. But his day took an unexpected turn when he received a call from his assistant, her voice unusually tense. "There's something you need to see," she said, forwarding him a link. It was a video clip from a local news station. His stomach tightened as he clicked play. The footage showed a snippet of his interaction with the police, captured by a bystander's phone. The caption read, "Racial profiling or routine stop. Local CO's encounter with police sparks debate." Within hours, the clip had gone viral, with thousands of shares and comments pouring in. Some people were outraged, calling it another example of systemic racism. Others, predictably, tried to defend the officers, insisting they were just doing their job. The man sighed, closing his laptop. He knew this was bound to happen sooner or later. He had become a public figure, and public figures didn't get the luxury of privacy. But he also knew this could be an opportunity, a chance to steer the conversation toward the bigger picture. That evening, he released a statement, addressing the incident and tying it to the broader issues his organization was working to solve. He spoke about the importance of building bridges between law enforcement and the community, emphasizing that accountability and collaboration were the only paths forward. The response was immediate and overwhelming. His statement was picked up by multiple media outlets, sparking panel discussions and think pieces. But not everyone was supportive. Some critics accused him of using the incident for personal gain, while others questioned whether his proposed solutions would actually work. Back at the precinct, tensions were rising. The younger officer was furious when he saw the video. "This is why you don't cut these guys any slack," he muttered, slamming his phone on the desk. "They'll turn it into a circus." But the older cop stayed quiet. He had a feeling things were about to escalate, and he wasn't wrong. The following week, the man in the suit received an anonymous email. The message was brief but pointed: "Stay out of our business, or there will be consequences." It wasn't the first time he'd faced resistance, but the directness of the threat gave him pause. He forwarded the email to his security team, who assured him they'd look into it. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. He had always known his work would make waves, but this felt different. Whoever sent that message wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they wanted him to stop, and they were willing to escalate if he didn't. At the same time, the older cop found himself at a crossroads. He couldn't ignore what he'd learned about the man, nor could he brush off the growing unrest within his department. Lines were being drawn, and he knew he would have to choose a side. Late one night, after his shift ended, he found himself driving back to the community center where they had first encountered the man in the suit. The lights were still on, and through the windows, he could see a group of people inside, deep in discussion. He sat in his car for a long moment, debating whether to go in. Finally, he stepped out and walked toward the door. If he was going to make a difference, it had to start here. The older cop stood just outside the door of the community center, the hum of voices from inside drifting through the cool night air. His hand hovered near the handle, hesitating. He'd spent years seeing the world through the narrow lens of his job, but now that view felt too small, too rigid. Tonight, he wasn't just a cop, he was someone trying to understand, maybe even to change. He pushed open the door. Inside, the meeting was in full swing. The man in the suit stood at the center, his presence commanding but approachable, as he spoke passionately about the upcoming launch of the community hubs. Around him, people nodded, their faces a mix of hope and determination. They were ready for something new, something better. The older cop lingered near the back, unnoticed at first, until the man's eyes landed on him. There was a brief pause in the conversation as the man acknowledged him with a nod, a silent but clear invitation to stay. The cop gave a small nod in return, taking a seat by the wall. He listened as the discussion continued, absorbing every word. It wasn't long before the conversation shifted to the challenges they faced. Funding gaps, logistical hurdles, and most pressing of all, the pushback from those who felt threatened by the changes. The man in the suit addressed each concern with a calm confidence, offering solutions and rallying the group. But there was no avoiding the reality of the resistance they were up against. After the meeting ended and people began to file out, the man approached the cop. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone neutral but curious. The cop rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling out of place. "I needed to see this for myself," he admitted. "To understand what you're really trying to do." The man nodded, studying him for a moment. "And now that you have?" The cop exhaled slowly. "It's good work," he said. "Important work. But you're stepping on a lot of toes. Some people won't take kindly to that." The man's expression didn't change. "Change is never easy," he said. "But it's necessary." The cop hesitated, then added, "There's more. I think someone inside the department is trying to sabotage your efforts. That email you got, it could be connected." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. "I suspected as much," he said. "Do you know who?" The cop shook his head. "Not yet. But I'm looking into it." For the next few weeks, the tension in the city grew. The community hubs were set to launch, and anticipation was high. But so was the resistance. The anonymous threats escalated, becoming more specific, more personal. The man in the suit doubled down on security measures, but he refused to back down. This was bigger than him, and he wouldn't let fear derail their progress. Then, on the eve of the launch, everything came to a head. The man received an urgent call from his security team. One of the hubs, a centerpiece of the project, had been vandalized. Windows shattered, equipment destroyed, walls defaced with hateful messages. It was a calculated attack, meant to send a clear message: "You're not welcome here." The man drove to the site immediately, his jaw set in grim determination. When he arrived, the scene was worse than he'd imagined. Community members had already gathered, their faces a mix of anger and heartbreak. But as he stood there, surveying the damage, his phone buzzed. It was the older cop. "I need you to come to the precinct," the cop said, his voice low and urgent. "I found something. You're going to want to see this." When the man arrived at the station, the cop led him to a quiet room in the back, away from prying eyes. On the table were several documents and a laptop. The cop pulled up a series of emails and internal memos, each one more damning than the last. They detailed a coordinated effort by a small group within the department to undermine the community hubs. The vandals weren't just random agitators, they were connected to the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. The man's expression hardened as he read through the evidence. "Who's behind this?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. The cop hesitated before naming a high-ranking officer, someone with a long history in the department and a reputation for opposing reform. "He's been pulling strings behind the scenes," the cop said. "And he's not working alone." The man leaned back, absorbing the weight of the revelation. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Before they could act, however, another call came in, this time from one of the community leaders. The vandalized hub was on fire. Flames lit up the night sky as firefighters battled the blaze, and the man's heart sank. This was the final warning from those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But instead of despair, the fire sparked something else in the community: unity. By morning, dozens of volunteers had gathered to begin cleaning up and rebuilding. The man in the suit stood among them, leading by example. The older cop was there too, quietly offering his help. Together, they sent a powerful message: no amount of destruction could break their resolve. The climax came when the man and the cop, armed with the evidence they'd gathered, confronted the corrupt officer in a public forum. With reporters and community members watching, the officer's actions were exposed. The fallout was immediate. He was suspended, pending a full investigation, and several others were implicated in the scheme. But just when it seemed the worst was over, an unexpected twist emerged. The investigation uncovered deeper corruption, revealing a network of individuals across multiple agencies who had been working together to suppress reform efforts. It wasn't just about the community hubs, it was about preserving a system that benefited the few at the expense of the many. This revelation rocked the city, but it also galvanized the movement. The man in the suit, once seen as an outsider challenging the norm, became a symbol of resilience and change. With renewed support, the community hubs launched successfully, and their impact was immediate. Crime rates dropped, trust in law enforcement began to rebuild, and opportunities flourished. The older cop, now retired, continued to work with the man in the suit, using his experience to bridge the gap between the police and the community. And though the road ahead was still challenging, they both knew they were on the right path. In the end, the man's work was about more than just changing a system, it was about changing hearts and minds. And even in the face of adversity, that change proved unstoppable. The flames of resistance had died down, leaving behind a community that stood taller, stronger, and more unified than ever before. In the weeks following the launch of the community hubs, the city began to transform. What had once been neighborhoods marked by neglect and mistrust now buzzed with activity and hope. The hubs weren't just places to access resources, they became symbols of possibility, where people came together to learn, grow, and support each other. The man in the suit, though exhausted, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Every time he walked into one of the hubs, he was reminded why he started this journey. He would see a young mother getting help with childcare, an aspiring entrepreneur attending a workshop, or a group of teenagers learning conflict resolution. Each story, each face, represented a small victory in the larger battle for equality and justice. But the journey hadn't just changed the community, it had changed him too. He found himself reflecting more on the weight of leadership, the balance between resilience and vulnerability. He'd faced challenges that could have easily derailed him, yet he never allowed fear or doubt to dictate his actions. Still, he knew the work was far from over. Systems didn't change overnight, and the pushback they'd faced was a clear reminder of the entrenched forces resistant to progress. The older cop, now a frequent visitor to the hubs, had become a quiet but powerful advocate for the cause. No longer burdened by the constraints of his badge, he used his voice and experience to foster understanding. He spent his time mentoring young officers and encouraging them to see policing as a partnership with the community, rather than a position of control. One day, as the two men sat on a bench outside one of the hubs, watching a group of kids play basketball, the cop broke the silence. "You know," he said, his eyes fixed on the court, "I used to think the badge was the only way to make a difference. That enforcing the law was enough. But I was wrong. It's not about the law, it's about trust." The man in the suit nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Trust takes time," he said. "But it starts with showing up, with listening. People need to know they're seen, that they matter." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of laughter and the thud of basketballs filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had hung over the city just months before. Now, there was a sense of possibility, a feeling that things could and would get better. As the days turned into weeks, the impact of the community hubs continued to grow. Data began to show measurable improvements: lower crime rates, higher employment, and increased school attendance. Local businesses flourished, and more importantly, people started to believe in their own potential again. The man's work caught national attention, leading to invitations to expand the model to other cities. He welcomed the opportunity but remained committed to his roots. He knew that for the change to be lasting, it had to come from within the communities themselves. His role was to empower, not dictate. One evening, as he prepared for yet another meeting, his assistant knocked on his office door. "You've got a visitor," she said, her tone light but knowing. He looked up, surprised. Standing behind her was the younger cop, the one who had been so quick to judge during their first encounter. He seemed different now, less defensive, more reflective. The man stood and extended his hand. The younger cop hesitated for a moment, then shook it. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said, his voice quieter than the man remembered. "About how I've been doing my job, and what it really means to serve." The man gestured for him to sit, curious to hear more. The younger cop spoke about the internal investigation, the fallout, and how it had forced him to confront his own biases. "I want to do better," he said finally. "I want to learn how to build trust, not just enforce rules." The man nodded, recognizing the sincerity in his voice. "That's a good start," he said. "Change begins with acknowledging where we've fallen short. And it continues with action." The two talked long into the evening, discussing ways to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. It was a conversation neither of them could have imagined having months ago, but it felt like another step in the right direction. As the younger cop left, the man felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, but moments like these reminded him why it was worth it. People could change. Systems could evolve. And with each small step, they were building a foundation for a better future. In the end, the story wasn't just about one man's mission or one community's fight for justice. It was about the power of collective action, about ordinary people coming together to create extraordinary change. It was about the courage to face adversity head-on, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. And as the city continued to grow and heal, it stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people refused to give up on each other. The man in the suit knew that their work would be a model for others, a blueprint for how to rebuild trust and foster resilience in a world that often seemed divided. But most importantly, it was a reminder that change, no matter how slow or difficult, was always possible. The final twist came quietly, almost unnoticed. One of the original community hubs, once a modest space in a struggling neighborhood, had become a thriving center of innovation and support. But its impact went beyond the city limits. A group of young leaders, inspired by what they had seen, had taken the model to their hometowns, starting their own hubs and sparking similar transformations. The ripple effect was undeniable. What started as one man's vision had become a movement, proof that when people invested in each other, they could build something extraordinary. And so, the story ended not with a grand conclusion, but with a simple truth: change begins with us, and together, there's nothing we can't achieve.